The night of fire. The night had begun like every other on the edge of the North Sea, with the wind whispering softly through the thatched roofs and the smell of burning wood rising gently from the hearths of a peaceful fishing village. Mothers were singing to their children. The waves were breaking softly along the shore, and the stars were reflected in the quiet waters like lanterns of heaven. Among the villagers was a young widow named Eira, who had buried her husband only a few months earlier, after he had perished in a storm at sea. She had 2 children, a son and a daughter, and though her heart was broken, she had learned to live quietly for their sake. The villagers respected her courage. Her hands were rough from weaving, and her voice carried calm strength that comforted others in times of fear. That evening, she sat beside the fire, mending nets and humming softly to keep her children asleep. She had no idea that before dawn, her life, and everything she knew, would be swallowed by a darkness that no prayer could hold back. The first sign came not as thunder or storm, but as an unnatural silence. Even the dogs stopped barking, and the sea, which had always been their protector, seemed to hold its breath. Eira felt it first, an ache deep inside her chest, as if the air itself had changed. Then came the faint sound of oars, steady, rhythmic, cruelly precise. The villagers had heard such tales before, whispers of ships carved like dragons that moved without mercy across the mist. But stories were one thing. The truth was another. When the first boat appeared from the fog, its sail black against the moonlight, Eira froze. The glow of torches followed, then another ship and another, until the horizon itself looked like a river of flame floating upon the water. She ran to the church bell, pulling its rope with all her strength, ringing the alarm that had never been used in her lifetime. The sound shattered the night, echoing across the valley as men stumbled from their huts, grabbing whatever they could. But it was already too late. The Northmen had come. The world turned to fire and fear. The wooden homes that once held laughter now roared with flames. Eira grabbed her children, clutching them to her chest as she ran toward the forest path that led inland. The smoke stung her eyes, but she did not stop. Behind her, the screams of her neighbors mixed with the clash of steel and the thunder of heavy boots. She could smell the salt and ash, could feel the heat licking at her back. The little girl in her arms was crying, whispering for her father, and Eira's heart broke again. She whispered, "Hold on, my love, just hold on," but her voice trembled. As they reached the edge of the woods, she turned once to look back at the burning village. In that single moment, she understood something that would stay with her forever, that the fire was not only destroying their homes, but their entire way of life. Every spark that flew into the sky carried the memory of generations, their songs, their faith, their small joys. It was all turning to ash before her eyes. When dawn finally came, the smoke had thinned, but the world lay silent. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and sorrow. Eira hid in a hollow beneath the roots of an old tree with her 2 children, trembling and waiting for the sound of footsteps to fade. She had not slept. Her body was cold, her hands still shaking. From her hiding place, she could see the village below, blackened ruins, the sea reflecting the red light of the still burning embers. The Viking ships rested at the shore like beasts feeding after the hunt. She watched as figures moved among the wreckage, not in haste, but with a strange order, searching, gathering, sorting what was left. Some of them carried away livestock. Others piled wooden chests, fabrics, and tools into small boats. And then she saw something that made her blood freeze. They were not only taking gold and food, they were taking people. The widows, the young women, those who had survived the fire, were being gathered together at the shore. They stood barefoot, their faces streaked with ash, their hands tied with rope. Eira clutched her children tighter, but her son, who was only 7, looked up at her with eyes too wise for his age and whispered, "Mother, they are taking them away." She could not answer. She only nodded, her heart breaking in silence. She knew that if she moved, if she made a sound, her children would be next. So she pressed her hand over her daughter's mouth and waited until the last sound of oars faded back into the sea. By evening, the smoke began to settle into gray mist, and the silence that followed was unbearable. The survivors who had escaped to the woods began to emerge, their faces blank, their eyes searching for what was no longer there. They walked through the ashes, calling names that no one answered. Children looked for parents. Husbands searched for wives. And widows, those who had already known loss, stood like shadows among the ruins, facing a new kind of grief. Era found her neighbor, an old woman who had lost everything but her memory, sitting beside the charred remains of her home, whispering prayers to gods who had been silent that night. Era sat beside her, unable to speak, only holding her hand. There were no words left. That night, under a pale moon, the widows gathered together at the churchyard. The building had survived, though its door was scorched, and the air inside smelled of smoke and sorrow. They sat in silence for a long time before anyone spoke. Finally, Era stood. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the dark. "They burned our homes," she said, "but not our will. They took our sisters, but not our hope. The gods have turned their faces away, but we will not." Her words were not shouted. They were whispered, steady and low, like a promise. One by one, the other women nodded. Some began to cry quietly. Others clenched their hands into fists. In that moment, a spark of something new was born. Not revenge, but survival. They were not warriors, but they were mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters who had endured the unendurable. And in their endurance, there was strength. As dawn came again, Era looked toward the sea. The horizon was empty now, the Viking ships gone like ghosts into the mist. Only the black ruins remained, but within those ashes something invisible had begun to grow. A will to rebuild, a quiet defiance that no sword could cut. She whispered to her children, "We will live. We will build again." Her voice broke, but her eyes were fierce. She didn't yet know how, or when, or where, but she knew one thing. As long as one widow still breathed, their story would not end. What had begun as the night of fire would become something greater, a journey of women who had lost everything, yet refused to disappear. And so, as the smoke drifted toward the northern sky, the widows buried their dead and began their long walk inland. Behind them, the sea swallowed the last traces of the raid. Ahead of them lay an uncertain world, but also a chance, however small, to begin again. The wind carried their whispered prayers over the hills, and somewhere, beyond the horizon, their sisters who had been taken would hear the same wind and know they were not forgotten. Chains and choices. The days that followed the burning of the village were like wandering through a dream that refused to end. The survivors, mostly women, old men, and frightened children, moved slowly inland, away from the smell of salt and smoke that still lingered in the air. Era walked with them, her children beside her, their faces pale but their small hands clinging tightly to hers. They carried nothing but what they could hold in a single cloth bundle, and each step felt heavier than the last. The land they once called home now seemed like a foreign place, stripped of color and life. The once familiar trees now looked darker, the rivers colder, and the songs of birds felt like echoes from another world. Yet in that endless silence, something stirred within them, a stubborn pulse of life that refused to die. They were broken but not finished. They had seen what no heart should see, but their hearts still beat. And that meant something. After several days of walking, the widows and survivors reached the ruins of an old Roman fort, long abandoned and half buried by time. Its walls were crumbling, covered in moss, but it offered shelter from the wind. Era and the others decided to stay there for the night. They built small fires with driftwood they carried, shared what little food they had, and wrapped their children in torn blankets. That night, as the flames flickered against the cold stones, the widows sat together in a circle. Their faces were lined with exhaustion, but their eyes carried the same quiet determination. Some spoke in whispers of what they had seen, of the women taken away, of the ships vanishing into the mist, of prayers unanswered. Others could not speak at all. Their grief had no words, yet among them Era's voice rose softly. She did not tell stories of loss, but of endurance. She spoke of her husband who had died fighting the sea but never surrendered to it, and she said that they must be like him, tired, wounded, but still alive. Her words settled over the group like a blanket of warmth, reminding them that while the world could take everything from them, it could not take their will to go on. The next morning, as the mist lifted, they began to plan. It was clear that they could not return to their village. The Norse ships might come again, and there was nothing left to rebuild. They needed a new home, a place hidden, safe, far from the reach of the sea raiders. Some of the older women remembered an abandoned valley beyond the forest, a place once used by shepherds long ago. Era agreed to lead them there. She had no weapons, no map, only courage, but courage was enough. For days, they moved quietly through the woods, carrying the children, scavenging roots, and foraging berries. Era taught them to listen to the earth, the whisper of water beneath the soil, the rustle of deer in the undergrowth, the song of distant streams. Her calm voice guided them through the fear, and slowly, one by one, the others began to believe that they could survive. Each step forward became a small act of rebellion against the fate the world had written for them. But fate, as always, was watching. On the seventh night, when the group had finally reached the hidden valley, they saw smoke rising once again, but this time not from their own fires. Down in the hollow, where a stream glimmered like a ribbon of silver, stood a small Viking encampment. The raiders had settled there for the winter, their ships anchored along the river bend. The widows froze, hidden among the trees, hearts pounding in terror. The memories of that first night came flooding back, the screams, the flames, the sound of oars cutting through water. For a moment no one breathed. One of the women wanted to turn back. Another began to cry softly, but Era placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "We cannot run forever." Her voice was steady, though her body trembled. She knew that the forest behind them held no food, no shelter, no safety. To survive, they had to face what they feared most, not with violence, but with wisdom. As the night deepened, Era made a choice. She would go alone to the camp and see what kind of men these Vikings were. Not all men were monsters, she thought, and even among wolves, there must be one who remembers what mercy means. Leaving her children with the others, she crept down the hill under the cover of darkness. The campfire below flickered around figures who spoke in a language she did not understand, laughing roughly, passing cups of ale. She watched them from behind a fallen tree, her breath shallow, her heart heavy. Then she saw something unexpected, a young Viking sitting apart from the others, sharpening his blade not with pride but with a strange sadness in his eyes. He looked no older than her husband had been. For a moment, Era saw not an enemy but another soul trapped in the same storm that had destroyed her world. She stepped forward, silent as the mist, until a twig snapped beneath her foot. The young man looked up instantly, his hand reaching for his sword. Their eyes met, hers filled with fear, his with shock, and in that frozen moment between life and death, something unspoken passed between them. He did not call out. Instead, he lowered his weapon slowly, his gaze steady. "You should not be here," he said in broken words of her tongue. Era said nothing. She wanted to run, but her body refused. The young Viking looked past her shoulder, perhaps seeing the faint shapes of other women hidden in the shadows, and his expression changed. He sighed, then whispered, "Go back. They will not spare you if they find you." Era took a step backward, confused by his tone. She had expected cruelty, not warning. She whispered, "Why?" And he answered simply, "Because I remember my mother." His voice cracked slightly, and Era felt something inside her shift. In that moment she saw the truth. The Vikings, for all their strength and terror, were not born as beasts. Some carried sorrow, others guilt, and a few perhaps the memory of what kindness once meant. Era returned to the others with that memory like a seed hidden in her heart. She told them that they could not stay, that the camp was too close, but she also told them not all hearts were lost to darkness. They decided to travel further north, deeper into the wilderness. The journey was brutal. Snow began to fall early that year, and food grew scarce. But within the hardship, something beautiful began to grow. The widows learned to work as one. They shared every scrap of food, took turns carrying the smallest children, built shelters from branches and mud, and sang to keep their courage alive. Each night, Era would whisper to them stories, not of gods or battles, but of endurance, of how the heart could survive what the body could not. Slowly, the fear that had once bound them began to loosen, replaced by a quiet strength that no conqueror could chain. One morning, after weeks of travel, they reached a wide plain where the river widened into a frozen lake. The sky above glowed faintly with northern light, and the mountains in the distance shimmered like silver shields. Era looked at it and whispered, "This is where we will live." The others followed her gaze, and for the first time since the night of fire, felt a glimmer of peace. They built their new homes from the fallen trees, dug the earth with their bare hands, and worked until their fingers bled. Each woman carried her pain like a stone in her heart, but together those stones built the foundation of something unbreakable. And though they had lost their husbands, their homes, and their world, They had found something new, each other. They were not just widows anymore. They were survivors, builders of a new beginning. But far across the frozen river, unseen in the fog, a shadow watched, the young Viking who had spared Era that night. His ship had moved north, his heart restless, haunted by the memory of the woman who had stood before him unarmed yet unafraid. As he looked toward the smoke rising from her new settlement, he felt a strange stirring, a thought that perhaps there was something stronger than conquest. He turned away, but he did not forget her. Fate, it seemed, was not finished with them both. The voyage north winter wrapped the world in silence, and snow covered the earth like a white shroud over memory. The widows who had survived the journey now lived in the valley they had built with their bare hands, a place hidden from the world and unknown to the men who once burned their homes. The huts stood close together, their roofs heavy with frost, and smoke from small fires rose like pale threads into the gray sky. Era moved among them each morning, tending to those who were weak, comforting those who still woke screaming from dreams of that terrible night. Her hands were blistered and raw, but her spirit had become like iron. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind howled through the trees, she would step outside, look at the northern stars, and whisper to the husband she had lost, promising him that their children would live to see peace again. She did not know that far beyond those mountains, a ship was sailing northward, carrying men who would change her fate once more. The young Viking named Arvid had not found peace since the night he saw Era. Her face haunted him, the firelight on her skin, the fear and courage in her eyes. He was a warrior by birth but not by heart. His father had been a raider, his brothers killers, yet Arvid had always felt out of place among them, a man carrying a weapon he did not believe in. When his crew decided to sail north for new settlements, Arvid joined them, but his mind was elsewhere. The sea that once thrilled him now felt endless and cold, each wave whispering questions he could not answer. As they sailed through the mist, he thought of the woman he had spared, wondering if she had survived the winter, if her children still breathed. Somewhere inside him, a small flame of remorse began to burn, and though he could not name it, that flame was the beginning of something rare, a conscience awakening in a time of iron and blood. The voyage north was long and harsh. Storms tore at the sails and ice formed on the ropes, cutting the men's hands until they bled. Food grew scarce, tempers flared, and despair began to spread among the crew. Yet in the darkest nights, when thunder rolled over the frozen sea, Arvid found himself staring at the horizon, searching not for land, but for meaning. The world around him was built on conquest, but he began to see that conquest left only emptiness behind. He remembered his mother's face before she had died, a gentle woman taken from the West, captured in a raid much like the ones he now led. Perhaps that was why he had spared Era. Perhaps he saw in her the same strength that once lived in his mother's eyes. He didn't know, but he knew this. The woman in the woods had changed him. And as the ship pressed northward, through storms and hunger, he began to wonder if fate had carried him on this path for a reason that no sword could fulfill. Back in the valley, Era's small settlement grew stronger. The widows worked as one body, each woman filling the space of many. They built a kiln for pottery, trapped animals for fur, and learned to trade quietly with wandering travelers who passed through the forest. Slowly, life returned, though the pain never truly left. Children grew, laughter began to echo again, and the sound of hammers and looms replaced the cries of despair. Era became their quiet leader, not by choice, but because her strength demanded it. She never raised her voice, yet when she spoke, people listened. She had learned that leadership was not about power, but about presence, not about commanding others, but about standing firm when others faltered. Still, in the quiet moments by the river, when her children slept, she would look at the water and see her reflection, wavering in the current and in those ripples. She would see the faces of those taken away, the widows who had not escaped, the sisters and daughters lost to the sea. Her heart would ache and she would whisper, "I will not forget you." It became her prayer, her vow, her purpose. One evening, as spring began to melt the snow, strange tracks appeared near the valley, large boot prints in the thawing mud, leading from the river to the edge of the woods. The women panicked, thinking the raiders had returned. Children were hidden, fires extinguished, and the settlement fell into fearful silence. Era stood by the path, her heart pounding, staring at the direction of the footprints. Something inside her told her these steps did not belong to an army. There were too few, too spaced apart, almost cautious, and then she saw him. Arvid emerged from the trees, unarmed, his cloak torn, his face gaunt from travel. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The others watched from behind the huts, ready to flee or fight, but Ira raised her hand and stopped them. The two souls, once enemies, now bound by something unseen, stood facing each other, the cold wind moving between them like a bridge of memory. Arvid spoke first. His voice was rough but soft, the tone of a man who had lost more than he had gained. "You live," he said quietly, almost as if he had not expected her to. Era nodded, her eyes wary but not hateful. "I live," she answered, "because you turned away." For a moment the world seemed to still. Arvid lowered his head, ashamed. "I have done many things I wish I could undo," he said, "but that night I saw something that made me stop." Era studied him in silence, searching for deception, but saw none. What she saw instead was exhaustion, regret, and something even rarer, humility. She stepped closer, the snow crunching softly beneath her feet, and asked, "Why are you here?" Arvid hesitated, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. "Because I cannot find peace," he said. "Not with them, not with myself. I came north to start anew, to leave the old ways behind. I thought I might build something that does not begin with fire." His words were simple, but they struck deep. For the first time since the raid, Ira saw not a Viking, not a conqueror, but a man trying to unmake his past. The widows did not trust him at first. Some wanted him gone, fearing he would bring others. But Ira remembered the fear she had seen in his eyes that night, the same fear she carried in her own heart, and she chose to believe that mercy could exist even among those who once brought ruin. Against all protests, she allowed him to stay, but under one condition. He would work as they worked, eat as they ate, and live by their rules. No weapons, no commands, no pride. Arvid agreed without hesitation. In the days that followed, he helped gather wood, repair roofs, and dig the new fields for planting. The widows watched him closely, but slowly, suspicion began to fade. He spoke little, but his hands never rested. He never complained, never demanded, and often shared his own food with the children. Over time, even the most fearful among them began to nod in greeting when he passed. What had begun as distrust slowly turned into something deeper, a fragile truce born from shared hardship. As the seasons turned, the valley changed. Flowers bloomed where once there had been ashes. The children who had once hidden from shadows now played in open sunlight. Era watched them and felt a warmth she had thought she would never feel again. And yet, within that warmth lay a quiet unease, for she knew peace was fragile, and the world beyond their valley had not changed. One night, as the fire crackled and the stars burned bright, Arvid sat beside her in silence. They did not speak for a long time. The only sound was the river's soft murmur and the wind through the trees. Then Era said softly, "Do you think men can change?" Arvid looked into the fire, his face lit by its glow. "I don't know," he answered, "but I know I must try." His words hung in the air, simple and honest. Era nodded slowly. "Then try here," she said, "not as a warrior, but as a builder." And in that moment, the wind that once carried screams now carried the faint sound of something new, hope. But fate is a patient watcher. Far to the south, another band of raiders had heard rumors of women surviving in the mountains, of a hidden village untouched by their reach. Greed travels faster than mercy, and soon, sails would again cut through the northern waters. The widow's peace had been hard-earned, but destiny was not finished testing them. Yet this time, they would not face it alone. For in their midst stood a man who had once come with fire, but now carried the will to protect what he had once destroyed. The story of the widows and the Viking was not one of revenge. It was one of redemption, born in the cold north, written not with swords, but with forgiveness, courage, and faith. that humanity could still rise from the ashes of its own darkness. The frozen shores. The first true winter in the valley came early that year, fierce and unyielding, sweeping down from the northern peaks with winds that howled like restless spirits. Snow blanketed the roofs of the widows' homes until they seemed to disappear into the white world around them. Days grew shorter, nights longer, and the sun itself seemed to struggle to rise. Yet within the walls of their small settlement, life pulsed with warmth and persistence. The widows had learned to make light from darkness, weaving together what little they had into something that resembled peace. The fires they built glowed like hearts inside the storm, and laughter, soft and rare, returned to their evenings. The sound of children playing among the trees was now more common than weeping, and that small miracle gave meaning to every cold breath they took. Era often stood at the edge of the frozen river, wrapped in a wool cloak Arvid had mended with his own hands, and watched the reflection of the aurora shimmer across the ice. She no longer feared the sea. The sound of waves far beyond the mountains no longer reminded her of fire and screams. It reminded her of endurance, of life continuing no matter how brutal the night. Arvid had become part of their world in quiet, steady ways. He spoke their language now, haltingly but earnestly, and he had learned to laugh again, something he had forgotten long ago. The children adored him, following him whenever he went, to chop wood or fix the fishing nets, curious about his strange words and his carved runes. He told them stories of the northern lights, of the sea gods who carried ships through storms, but he spoke of them gently, as tales of wonder rather than worship. The widows who had once watched him with suspicion began to see him not as the shadow of their past, but as a sign that even the heart of a raider could change. There was a quiet bond forming between him and Era, one built not on desire or chance, but on shared survival and mutual respect. It was something neither of them could name, something fragile and human that seemed to grow stronger with every day they worked side by side. When they repaired the fences together or shared a cup of broth in the evening silence, their eyes would meet for a moment longer than necessary, and both would look away with a faint, uncertain smile. But peace, like all fragile things, draws the attention of the restless. Beyond the mountains and across the frozen shore, word had spread of the hidden valley, a place where women lived freely, untouched by the rule of men, protected by a foreigner who once wore the dragon mark of the north. Traders who passed through told stories in distant taverns, and soon men who had lost everything in wars and raids began to wonder if such a place truly existed. Among them was a war captain named Ragnar Valt, a man hardened by loss and hungry for power. He had once led a fleet of ships that burned 100 villages, but after years of blood and betrayal, he was left with only a handful of desperate followers and empty hands. When he heard of the valley, he did not see widows or peace. He saw wealth, labor, and the chance to rebuild his glory. So as the ice began to thaw, his men began to prepare their ships. The sound of their hammers echoed across the fjord like an omen carried on the wind. In the valley, the first warning came from the birds. Flocks that had flown low through winter now vanished into the clouds, and the wolves that roamed the ridges began to move further inland. Era noticed it first. Her instincts, sharpened by hardship, felt the shift in the air, the kind of silence that falls before disaster. One night, as the snow fell softly outside, she found Arvid sitting by the fire, repairing a broken axe handle. She told him what she felt, and he listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment. His expression, unreadable, then said, "The sea never forgets its own." She understood immediately. It was not superstition, it was warning. Arvid rose and went outside, standing in the cold night air, looking toward the distant horizon where he could almost sense the ships gathering. For years he had lived as one of them. He knew their hunger, their need to conquer what they did not understand. He knew that if they came, they would not spare anyone, not even him. Over the following days, Arvid worked with fierce determination. He built defenses from logs, reinforced the huts, and trained the older boys to handle bows and spears. The widows worked beside him, their fear replaced by purpose. Era moved among them like the calm at the center of the storm, reminding them that courage did not mean absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. She taught the women how to set traps, how to hide the youngest in caves nearby if danger came. Every plan they made was simple yet full of faith. They were not preparing for war, they were preparing to protect life, and that difference made all the strength they needed. Arvid, meanwhile, wrestled with something far heavier inside himself. He had spent his life breaking things. Now he was learning to build, and he feared he might not be able to save what he had come to love. In quiet moments when Era wasn't looking, he would touch the wooden pendant around his neck, carved with the rune for forgiveness, and whisper a prayer to the gods he no longer fully believed in. The day the ships appeared was clear and cold, the sky a sharp blue against the white landscape. The widows saw them first, 3 dark shapes moving slowly along the frozen river, cutting through the ice with their long oars. Smoke from their torches rose in thin black lines like claws scratching the sky. Panic spread through the valley, but Era's voice rose above it, calm and steady. "Do not run," she said. "If we flee, we lose everything again. This time, we stand." The widows formed a circle around the children while Arvid moved to the riverbank, his breath clouding in the cold. As the ships came closer, he saw the sigil on their sails, a wolf painted in red, and his heart sank. He knew that symbol. It belonged to Ragnar Valt, a man who knew no mercy, a man who believed strength was the only law worth following. Arvid turned to Era and whispered, "He will not reason." Era's reply was quiet but fierce. "Then let him see what reason looks like." When the ships reached the shore, Ragnar stepped forward, his beard thick with frost, his eyes like winter steel. "So," he said, his voice carrying across the ice, "the stories were true. A valley of women, ruled by ghosts and traitors." His men laughed behind him, their voices echoing through the frozen air. Arvid stepped forward, his jaw set. "This land is not yours," he said. "It belongs to those who built it." Ragnar looked at him with disbelief, then with recognition. "Arvid," he said slowly, "the sea spat you out after all." He sneered. "Do you play shepherd now? Do you protect cattle instead of taking them?" Arvid did not answer. He only stood tall, his hands clenched at his sides. Ragnar's eyes swept over the women behind him, and his smirk deepened. "You could have been a king among us, but you chose to die with slaves. Fool." But what Ragnar did not understand was that Arvid had already found something greater than kingship. He had found purpose, and purpose makes even the weakest man unbreakable. When Ragnar's men tried to step forward, the valley answered, not with swords, but with courage. The widows lit the trenches Arvid had built, and lines of fire erupted across the snow, cutting the raiders off. The light blazed so fiercely that for a moment, the whole valley looked like it was burning again. But this time the fire was not destruction, it was defiance. The attackers hesitated, blinded by the sudden flames. Era stood beside Arvid, her cloak whipping in the wind, her voice rising like a clear bell. "You have taken enough," she shouted. "There is nothing left for you here but shame." Her words carried not just through the valley, but into the hearts of those who heard them, both friend and foe. For a moment, even Ragnar's men faltered. They saw not helpless women, but a people who refused to kneel. The fight that followed was brief, more storm than battle. The raiders, unprepared for the traps and terrain, retreated into confusion. Some fled back toward the river, slipping on the ice. Others dropped their torches, setting fire to their own supplies. Arvid faced Ragnar on the frozen shore. The two men stood like reflections of different pasts, one clinging to the old world of blood, the other defending a new world of hope. Ragnar's strength was raw and fierce, but Arvid's was quiet and rooted. When the ice beneath them cracked, Ragnar's footing failed, and the cold sea that had once carried his power swallowed him whole. Silence followed, deep and final. The surviving raiders fled into the forest, their shouts fading with the wind. The widows did not cheer, for they knew that no victory erased the pain that had come before. But as the firelight flickered over their faces, there was no fear in their eyes anymore, only pride and the steady breath of freedom. That night, when the stars returned, Era stood by the river once again. Arvid joined her, his arm bound with cloth from a shallow wound. For a long time, they said nothing. The ice cracked softly under their feet, the sound like a sigh of relief from the earth itself. Finally, Era turned to him and whispered, "You kept your promise." He looked at her and said, "No, we kept it together." Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled, not a smile of joy but of peace. Above them, the northern lights danced across the sky like ribbons of green fire, reflecting in the water below. For years the widows had lived in shadow, but now they stood bathed in light. They had not just survived, they had changed the very meaning of strength. And as the aurora rippled above the frozen shores, it seemed to whisper the same truth that Era and Arvid had both learned, that sometimes the greatest victories are not won with swords, but with mercy, courage, and the unyielding will to begin again. The dawn of defiance. The battle on the frozen shore marked the end of fear for the widows, but not the end of struggle. When the last of Ragnar's men vanished into the forest, leaving their broken weapons scattered on the ice, the valley fell into a silence unlike any it had known before. It was not the silence of despair, but the silence that comes after a storm, the stillness of hearts that have endured everything and are still beating. The fires they had lit for defense now burned low, their smoke curling gently into the pale morning light. The widows gathered around the embers, exhausted, trembling, but alive. Their faces were streaked with ash and tears, yet their eyes shone with something unbreakable. They had faced the fury of men who had once ruled the seas, and they had not only survived, they had defended what was theirs. No song was sung, no words were shouted, yet every breath they took that morning was a quiet declaration to the world that the powerless were no longer silent. Era stood by the riverbank, her cloak fluttering in the wind, watching as the sun rose over the ice. Its golden light fell across the valley, touching the roofs, the trees, and the snow with warmth that felt almost sacred. For the first time in years, she did not feel haunted by fire. The flames she saw now were the fires of survival, not the ones that destroy, but the ones that sustain. Her children ran toward her, their laughter echoing softly through the cold air, and when she knelt to embrace them, tears filled her eyes. They were still here. They had seen horror, loss, and fear, yet they were still capable of smiling. That was when Era understood that true victory was not in defeating enemies, but in keeping one's heart alive through the darkness. Around her, the other widows began to rebuild the fires, tending to the wounded, comforting the frightened, and collecting what little could be saved from the night's chaos. The valley, which had once been a refuge built from sorrow, now became a place of rebirth. Arvid moved among them quietly, his arm bound in cloth from his wound, his expression calm but heavy with reflection. The men who had fought beside Ragnar were gone, but their shadows lingered in his mind, reminders of the life he had left behind. The warrior in him had died that day on the ice, and something gentler had taken its place. He no longer saw strength as domination. He saw it as endurance, compassion, and the ability to protect rather than conquer. When he passed by the children, they reached out to touch his rough hands, smiling up at him as if he had always been one of them. He could not help but smile back, though his heart ached with humility. Later that night, as the widows gathered around a great fire to warm themselves, Era looked at Arvid and said softly, "You came to destroy, and yet you built. You came as a stranger, and now you are part of us." Arvid did not answer for a long moment. His eyes reflected the firelight as he whispered, "No, Era, you are the builders. I only followed your strength." Through the long months that followed, life in the valley began to bloom once again. The widows worked tirelessly, planting seeds, repairing homes, and restoring what the storm had nearly taken from them. The seasons changed slowly, and when the snow finally melted, the earth revealed green beneath the white. Crops began to grow, and the rivers carried the promise of fish and renewal. The valley, once hidden and afraid, now stood as a living symbol of what could rise from ruin. Travelers who passed through spoke in awe of the community that had built itself from ashes, led by women who refused to bend. Some called it a miracle. Others whispered that it was a curse upon the old ways of men. But for Era and her sisters, it was simply life, the life they had earned with their courage. The news of the valley's survival spread quietly across the north. Other widows, outcasts, and broken souls began to find their way there, guided by rumor and hope. Some had fled war, others had lost families, but all shared the same longing, a place where they could live without fear. Era welcomed them all. Each new face carried a story of pain, but together, those stories became a song of unity. Soon the small valley grew into a thriving village. New homes were built beside the old ones, New children were born, and the sound of hammers, laughter, and prayers filled the air. The once forgotten fortresses of men were replaced by something greater, a community born of compassion. And among them all, Era remained their heart, quiet and steadfast, her spirit woven into every home, every fire, every heartbeat that echoed through the frozen hills. Arvid stayed by her side through every season. Though the past still weighed upon him, he found peace in labor and purpose in kindness. He carved tools, taught the young how to mend boats, and even helped the widows trade goods with travelers who passed along the river. The children grew to see him as a protector, and the older women began to speak his name without fear. Yet even as he found his place, he knew that the world beyond the valley had not changed. Raids still happened, wars still raged, and there were still those who believed power belonged only to those who took it. One evening, when the northern sky blazed red with sunset, Arvid said to Era, "They will come again someday, others like them. What we have built, it will test their hearts." Era looked at him, her eyes calm. "Then let them come," she said. "Let them see that what we build cannot be burned." Her words were not boastful, but certain, the kind of certainty that comes from having lost everything and still choosing to believe in light. As years passed, the valley began to change the people who entered it. Men who stumbled upon it expecting to find weakness found strength instead, not the strength of swords, but the strength of compassion. The widows offered food to strangers, healed travelers, and shared their stories not with anger, but with grace. Slowly, the legend of the widows spread across distant lands. People whispered of a northern valley where women ruled with kindness, where former warriors laid down their blades, and where even the coldest hearts found warmth again. Many dismissed it as a tale told to children, but those who had seen it with their own eyes knew it was real. And deep within that valley, Era would often look at the horizon and feel something larger than herself, not pride, but purpose. She understood that the valley was no longer just their refuge. It had become a symbol, a promise that the world could still change if hearts were brave enough to try. One winter night, years after the battle, Arvid sat by the fire while snow fell outside. The children had grown into young men and women, and Ira's hair had begun to turn silver, but her eyes still shone with the same fierce light. She sat beside him, watching the flames dance. After a long silence, she said softly, "When I was young, I believed strength was something men carried in their hands. But now I see it lives in what we choose to protect." Arvid nodded, his voice low. "You taught me that," he said. "You showed me what strength really is." Era smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "Life taught us both." They sat in silence again, listening to the sound of the fire crackling, the wind moving gently through the trees, and the river murmuring in the distance. The same river that had once carried death now carried peace. When dawn came, the snow glowed gold under the rising sun, and the valley awakened once more to the quiet rhythm of life. Smoke rose from the chimneys, children's laughter echoed through the frost, and the mountains stood tall, guarding their secret paradise. The widows of the north had not only survived, they had changed the meaning of survival itself. From their pain had grown a legacy, one that no fire could burn and no winter could erase. They had shown that courage does not belong only to warriors, and that even in the coldest lands, compassion could be a flame that never dies. And as the first light of morning touched the horizon, Era stepped outside her home and looked at the frozen shores below. The ice shimmered like glass, reflecting the dawn sky, and she whispered to herself, "This is not the end of our story. This is the beginning of our defiance." Her words floated into the cold air, carried by the wind toward the sea. The same sea that had once brought ruin, but now carried whispers of hope. Somewhere beyond those waves, sailors would speak of a land where widows rose from ashes and built a world stronger than steel. They would call it many things: the Valley of Women, the dawn of defiance, the home that the gods forgot. But for Era and her people, it would always be one thing: home. The legacy of the widow's years passed like the slow drift of seasons across the northern hills, and the valley that had once been built from ruin became a world of its own. The widows who had come as refugees grew old with grace, their faces lined with the stories of everything they had endured. Children who had once trembled in fear of thunder now laughed when storms rolled across the mountains. The river that had once frozen with sorrow now sang all year long, carrying the sound of life through the valley. The people had learned to read the sky, to listen to the earth, to speak to one another not with power but with understanding. And at the heart of it all was Era, whose name had become a whisper of strength among generations. She was no longer just the widow who had survived. She was the keeper of their memory, the voice that reminded everyone that the past was not a wound to hide, but a root to grow from. Her hair had turned white like the snow. Her steps had slowed, yet her eyes still held the same calm fire, the quiet light that could make even the coldest night feel bearable. Arvid had aged beside her, his once broad shoulders now bent from years of labor, his hands scarred but steady. The children called him Father of the Valley, though he never asked for such a name. He would laugh softly when they said it, his voice gentle, carrying none of the pride of warriors, but the humility of a man who had finally found peace. He often sat by the river in the evenings, carving wood into small shapes, birds, stars, boats, and left them by the water's edge for the children to find in the morning. When asked why, he would simply say, "Because every story must leave something behind." He had learned that legacy was not the gold one buried or the monuments one built. It was the quiet things, the kindness left in others, the courage planted in a child's heart, the love that kept growing long after words were gone. Sometimes, when the night was still, he and Era would sit together by the fire and talk about the world that used to be. They would speak not of pain, but of gratitude, for the chance they had been given to rebuild something that would outlive them both. In time, the valley became more than a refuge. It became a beacon. Travelers came from distant lands, guided by stories carried along the trade routes, stories of women who defied warriors, of a community born from ashes that thrived in the cold north. Some came seeking wisdom, others came seeking forgiveness, and all found something they had not expected: peace. The widows welcomed everyone, not with suspicion but with grace. Those who came from lands of conquest learned to lay down their weapons, to trade in food and song instead of fear. Over the years, the valley grew into a place where different languages blended together, where children with dark hair and fair hair played side by side, and where no one was judged by their blood or their past. The old pain never disappeared, but it changed shape, becoming a lesson instead of a scar. It reminded them all that freedom was not given by kings or won by swords. It was built in the hearts of people who refused to hate. As decades passed, new generations began to forget the details of the raid that had started it all, but they never forgot its meaning. Every year, on the night the northern lights burned brightest, the people gathered beside the frozen shore to honor the widows who had first built the valley. Fires were lit along the riverbank and stories were told, not of revenge or loss, but of courage, unity, and compassion. Children would listen wide-eyed as the elders spoke of Ira, the woman who had once faced the storm and chose to rebuild instead of destroy. They would hear of Arvid, the man who had walked away from war and found redemption in the work of his hands. The stories became songs, and the songs became legends. In faraway lands, sailors spoke of a place called the Valley of Widows, where even the fiercest hearts softened, and where the northern lights were said to dance in honor of those who loved without fear. But legends, like life, change with time. Centuries later, when the valley had grown into a small kingdom, travelers still spoke of its founders. Scholars searched for proof, for bones, for ruins, for relics of the first settlement. They found fragments of pottery marked with Celtic spirals, tools shaped by foreign hands, and carvings of a woman holding a flame in one hand and a dove in the other. None could say for certain if it was Era, yet everyone knew it was her. She had become more than a person. She had become an idea, the idea that love and courage could reshape the course of history. Even when time erased her face, it could not erase her echo. The widows had built more than homes. They had built a vision of humanity that survived the centuries like a fire kept alive through endless winters. In her final years, Era would often walk to the edge of the valley where the river met the frozen sea. Arvid would walk beside her, their silence filled with the voices of memory. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the snow in gold and crimson, Ira looked toward the horizon and said softly, "Do you hear it?" Arvid listened. There was only the sound of waves. "It's the sea," he said. Ira shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "It's them, the ones we lost. They speak through the wind now. Her words drifted across the air like the last verse of a prayer. Arvid took her hand, and together they stood watching the sunset until the light faded. That night, Era passed away in her sleep, her face calm, her hands folded over her heart. When dawn came, the people of the valley gathered around her home in silence. There was no morning cry, only the sound of the river and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. They buried her on the high hill overlooking the sea where the first fires had once burned. Over her grave they placed a simple stone marked with 3 words. She endured, she led. Arvid lived for a few more winters, caring for the valley as she had done. On the last night of his life, when the northern lights shimmered above, he walked once more to her grave and sat beside it until the snow covered his cloak. When morning came, they found him there, smiling faintly, his hand resting on the stone. They buried him beside her, and from that place grew a tree whose roots wrapped around their graves and whose branches reached toward the sky like arms raised in prayer. In the years that followed, the people came to that tree for guidance. Lovers were married beneath its leaves, children were blessed there, and travelers would leave offerings of flowers or carved wooden birds, the same kind Arvid had once made. The valley flourished, and its story became the heart of a new culture that valued peace over pride, compassion over conquest, love over fear. The widows had once been victims of war, but through their courage, they had become teachers of humanity. Centuries later, when kingdoms rose and fell, when ships once again crossed the northern seas, and when the world began to forget the old stories, the legend of Era and the widows endured in whispers. Some said the northern lights were their spirits dancing across the heavens. Others said that when the wind howled through the mountains in winter, it carried the voices of those first women who had refused to die in silence. But the truth was simpler and greater. Their legacy lived in every act of kindness, in every heart that chose compassion over cruelty, in every home that was rebuilt after loss. The valley they had built was no longer just a place on a map. It was a symbol in the soul of humankind, and so the story of the widows did not end with their deaths. It became the story of us all, of every person who has ever stood amid ruin and said, "I will not bow." Their courage crossed centuries, their mercy softened empires, and their hope became the thread that held generations together. Even now, when the aurora lights up the winter sky, those who stand beneath it swear they can hear a voice in the wind, a woman's voice, gentle but strong, whispering the same truth she once spoke beside a burning village. They burned our homes, but not our will. And in that whisper lives everything the world must never forget, that love can rise from ashes, that kindness can outlive cruelty, and that even when the night is endless, there will always be a dawn waiting to be born.